right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome today. My name is Alyssa Zenz, and I am the pro bono counsel at Dorsey and Whitney Law Firm. And I also serve on the board for Legal Core. And Legal Core is a nonprofit that exists to help small businesses, minority-owned businesses, and small nonprofits with different transactional law issues. And they connect businesses in need with volunteer lawyers. And so part of what Legal Core can do for you is help connect you with a lawyer so you're not feeling alone. And those lawyers come from Dorsey and they come from other law firms around town. And so one of the big things we really want you to know is that you're not alone and that we stand with you. We're here for you. We want to help you rebuild. We want to help all the small businesses and vibrant businesses in our community be able to recover. And so that's the reason that we're here with this webinar series for you. And we have a team of lawyers that have been working together over these past few days to try to address some of the issues that we know you'll be facing. And then we know there'll be other things that we haven't thought of. And so we'll come back to figuring out how to make sure we answer all of your questions. For today, I'm going to currently turn things over to Dorsey partner Dan Brown, who did the lion's share of the work of pulling together your whole team of panelists. So thank you, Dan, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Alyssa, and thank you to everyone on this webinar for joining. We're really pleased to have you. We're super pleased to get a chance to help as much as we can in this process. And I wanted to take just a minute here to tell you a little bit about me and then a little bit about what we're going to be doing over the next week for those of you who are interested in not just this program on insurance, but on some of the other programs as well. So I'm Dan Brown. I'm a partner in our Minneapolis office of Dorsey and Whitney. One of the things that I do as a partner here is I help with insurance claims for lots of folks. And I'm typically helping folks get insurance payments. So I'm excited to be able to help in terms of telling you folks a little bit about what the insurance world is like, what you might expect in that claims process. That's what we're going to be doing today. And then we're also very excited at Dorsey to be presenting a series of these webinars over the next week on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and hopefully Friday next week as well. About an hour and a half each time for those of you who can make it and others who may make it as well on a variety of issues. We'll talk at the end of the program about what some of those are going to look like as we go forward into next week. With me today is a partner of mine, Skip DeRocher. Skip is one of the preeminent insurance coverage lawyers in the Minneapolis area and has a nationwide practice as well. So I think we're very fortunate to have Skip joining us in terms of talking about our insurance coverage issues and some of the steps in the process. So Skip, if you'd take a moment maybe and introduce yourself.
You bet. Thank you, Dan. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to be here, and hopefully we'll be able to provide some helpful information for you all today. As Dan mentioned, I do a fair amount of insurance coverage work, and Dan and I have actually had the pleasure of working together on a few insurance coverage matters. And when we are in the office and not working from home due to COVID-19, our offices are actually right next to each other. So it works out pretty well because we can swing by and just talk about insurance because that's such an interesting topic to both of us. So anyway, we're here today to talk about insurance coverage and particularly we're going to focus pretty heavily on property insurance. The agenda for today, we're going to talk, as I mentioned, primarily about property insurance, but we'll also mention some other types of insurance that might offer some coverage here in light of any damage that businesses may have suffered as a result of the civil protests and some of the problems that arose as a result of that. But primarily we're going to talk about property insurance, and that will be including both physical damage to your business and to your business property, but then also part of your property coverage is there's something called business interruption and that extra expense coverage. And sometimes that's not as well understood, but it could be a really important part of your property coverage. So we'll talk about that as well. And then toward the end of the session, I think Dan's going to spend a few minutes talking about a couple of other coverages that could come into play depending on what happened with your business. There may be some coverage under a crime policy, and sometimes you have a standalone crime policy. Sometimes it's connected to your property policy as an add-on. And you also might have an auto insurance claim. So that's what we will be covering. And at the end, we'll put other down there because we'll be taking questions. I think at the end, and there may be some other topics that you all want to talk about that relates to insurance. So.
I do want to mention, if anyone has any questions that pop up throughout, go ahead and open up your chat function. And if you don't know how to do that, if you scroll over your ribbon on your screen, there should be a more option, and then it should open your chat box. And so you can place a question there. We'll answer those at the end, but anytime they pop into your head throughout the presentation, feel free to put them there. You can also email me. For those who received the PowerPoint from me this morning, that's fine as well.
Great. Okay, well, thank you. And we can move to the next slide. So I'll chat just a little bit about first steps, that you might be facing at this point if you in fact did suffer some sort of damage to your property. And the very first thing that you should be doing is contacting your insurance agent or your insurance broker. Presumably, you use someone to help you purchase your policy, and if that's a broker, reach out to them, tell them what happened, and basically all you have to do is ask them to submit a claim, and tell them to submit the claim for all insurance that might apply. Brokers are, they're typically experts in their field, and they should have a pretty good idea of what coverages might be implicated after you've given them sort of a factual rundown of what happened. And then you can kind of put the burden on them, and they gladly accept it, typically, to send that notice out. And the notice, the very first notice, there's not much to it. It's just basically recounting when something happened, what happened, and a request for coverage. So, and when you do, so when you do that, that will get the process started. The other challenge that sometimes you face, and Dan and I face this all the time when we're working with clients on a coverage issue. One of the first things we'll ask about is do you have coverage? Have you submitted a claim? And typically they'll say, well, the client will say, gosh, no, but can you look at my policy? And we'll say, well, can you send it to us, or can you provide it to us? And I guess at least half the time, the client does not have a current copy of the policy. I might get an old copy, and that's better than nothing. But a lot of times the client doesn't have a copy at all. So if you don't have a copy, don't fret. Typically, again, your insurance agent or broker should have a copy and can get that to you. If you failing that, if your broker's not responsive, typically we could help you track down a policy by contact. If you at least know the name of your insurance company, we can help you find the policy. Because as you're going to hear, I think from both Dan and me today, policy language, while there's a lot of generalities and a lot of things are the same, there are also some differences from policy to policy, and the wording is important. And if in order to really understand what your rights are, we need to see, or you'd need to see anyway, what that policy says. So you contact your broker, you find your insurance policies that might be offering coverage, and then the next thing, and I'm going to turn this over to Dan to talk just a little bit about gathering some evidence and what you might need to do there. So Dan, do you want to take that?
Sure, thanks. So of course, once you're thinking about submitting that insurance claim, and you may be doing some of this already, depending on what your circumstances are, and if you've experienced some damage to your business or someone who has, it's going to be really important to be doing what you can do to take some pictures of things, to get some of that evidence pulled together of sort of what the building looked like before, or what your inventory looked like before, and to sort of assemble those sorts of records as best you can. They're going to be super relevant all the way through this process. The insurance company is going to have questions as they go through the process. And so the more you can do now to be making sure that you're holding on to the things that will help you demonstrate what the damages were and what maybe your losses were. If you have a business interruption claim, as Skip and I are going to talk about in a bit here, knowing sort of what your business was doing and sort of what's happened to it now on the basis of any damage that you've sustained. Those are all going to be important things to be keeping in mind. And ordinarily, when we're helping folks with their insurance claims, we're helping do that too, and making sure that we get out there and put all that stuff in one place. So that's highly recommended that you do that even starting now.
And Dan, let me, if you don't mind me just jumping in real quick. Yeah, so what Dan's talking about is, so what pictures do you have now of what the property used to look like before the damage, was incurred? And then, of course, also taking pictures now to show what the difference is and how it's been harmed. But the other thing I guess I'd point out is, regardless of what happened here, it doesn't hurt you to go through and go take pictures of your property now and put them someplace, store them on your phone or someplace, so that in the event that there's a claim down the road, some new, problem comes up. If you don't have any pictures now, at least take some now, so the next time you'll be prepared to make an insurance claim. So I just wanted to add that, Dan.
Yeah, really good. Really good. All right. And then the other bullet that we've got here is a first step. And we certainly do recognize, particularly given what the protests have been about, that there's some sensitivity around this issue. But we'll just tell you that as attorneys who do this typically and work with the insurance companies typically, insurance companies are going to expect that if you're making a claim based upon damage, or you're making a claim based upon your inventory being looted or anything like that, they are going to expect that there's been a contact with the police, and that there would be a police report reporting the incident and sort of itemizing what the police can gather about the information on it. So if you haven't yet, and you can, we do recommend getting a police report put together by the police on any damage that you've sustained or any losses that you've incurred.
And the police, they're not always the most responsive to come back out, especially if there's not an emergency. So it may be days, before you hear back. But the important thing is at least to make that request, and document the fact that you made that request, so that when the insurance company asks, you can at least say, I've done my part. I've asked the police to come out and take a look. Haven't heard back from them yet. And, in case you haven't, but at least document that and know the dates you made the request and how you made it.
All right, I think we can move on to maybe 2 slides, because we're going to talk about property insurance a little bit more specifically here. And the first question that we've got whenever we're dealing with a property insurance policy is, did you suffer property damage or loss? And although insurance policies can differ a little bit, almost every policy is going to have some version of the words that the insurance company will pay for direct physical loss or damage to the covered property. And so the question that we always ask ourselves is, what constitutes direct physical loss of or damage to the property? And generally speaking, we're looking for what you might expect. We're looking for those actual things that have been broken, things that are, if it's fire, if things have been lost, carried away in looting, those types of things, just to make sure that you're actually zeroing in on, the actual damage to your property.
And I like to just add things in here every once in a while. Yeah. So my apologies, Dan, but
no, that's good.
One thing that might, be a little bit out of the ordinary, and that you might not think, is this damage or not, is like, for example, smoke damage or water damage. Even if your property wasn't set on fire, but you've suffered smoke damage that creates a bad smell, or if you've got, if you sell food and the food is damaged because of smoke, those are the kinds of things where courts can be pretty expansive on what constitutes physical loss of or damage. And so if you're not sure, talk to, we're going to give you contact information about how to talk to a lawyer for free, and, talk to a lawyer, because we can help you and say, yeah, a court has already addressed that issue someplace and has said, yeah, that is property damage. So.
Perfect. Yeah. All right, let's, Skip, you want to take this slide now?
Yeah. Yep, you bet. Covered property. So, this is the same phrase on this slide that we saw on the previous slide. And this is, like, as Dan said, sort of typical language you'd see in a property insurance policy. And Dan covered the first question, that they'll pay for direct physical loss of or damage to covered property. So we've talked about that, what's the physical loss of or damage to. But another question is, what is covered property? And you'll see here that this is a capitalized term in the policy, covered property. And that's because it's a defined term, and the policy will tell you how you figure out what property is covered by the policy. And typically what you'll find is that the property that's covered by the policy is going to be described somewhere. It may be in the application that you fill out for the insurance. It may be in a schedule to the policy itself. It may be on the declarations page, which is the page at the start of your policy that lays out your premium, the term of the policy, and sometimes it'll then also identify what's the covered property. And sometimes it'll also, and just so you get a sense of this, what it would include typically is buildings and structures that are identified, the contents of the building, buildings and structures that are in the course of construction typically would be covered, and then outdoor property. And some of those things, you got to look at the specific policy again, like trees, shrubs, things like that, as to if there was damage to those. Sometimes policies will make clear that those are things that are not covered. But anyway, you'll want to look to the policy to see what is the covered property. And, I'm dealing with a property loss right now for a client on a fire loss. And one of the issues that we're going to deal with, I think, is how the property was valued. Because a lot of times when you fill out a property policy and you list the property that's going to be covered, there will be a statement of values that's associated with each of those covered pieces of property. And the insurance company a lot of times will then use that as sort of the upper limit of what they'll pay out for that particular piece of property. So be mindful of that. When you're looking at the policy, be aware that the insurance company, if there is a statement of values, may try to use that against you as they're trying to determine what the loss is. Dan, any other thoughts or comments on that?
No, thanks. I'll chime in just a little bit on what is the covered property. That I will say that it is not uncommon. It happens fairly frequently that somebody will go to their declarations page that Skip was describing, and maybe the description of that property isn't sort of exactly what it is that you've now got that damage on, or maybe you listed one property and there's a different property that you had, that sort of thing. And so if the address doesn't match up quite right, or as Skip was saying, the amounts don't match up quite right, I think we would just caution that all is not lost at that moment. You do have to go back and take a look maybe at what your application was and see what you described the property as being. You can potentially get some coverage even though that schedule maybe wasn't right or didn't include everything that you wanted. And so we would recommend that that's definitely an area in which, whether it's you're emailing one of us or whether you're working through legal court or something else, that you ask questions of folks about what would my options be, even if the schedule of that covered property doesn't seem to be right for what it is I'm looking at now. So I just want to make sure that folks do take every advantage, even if it seems like there's a problem with that covered property.
Yeah, that's a good point, Dan. And then just like going back to the photographs that we talked about earlier, use this as an opportunity to fix any problems that you find with the policy. So if you find that either the statement of values isn't up to current with maybe that was filled out a few years ago and nobody updated it, maybe there's changes to the structures, make sure even putting aside any claim you've got right now, use this as an opportunity when you're looking at your policy to make sure things are accurate and work with your broker if they're not, to get them updated.
Great. It is something, by the way, that brokers should be doing on a yearly or at least near yearly basis to make sure the broker is asking you questions about what's covered and what changes have happened to your business, so that they're always updating the insurance to make sure that it tracks what you're doing.
Right. And as Dan said, all is not lost if there's some discrepancies. And a lot of times the insurance company will be coming out on a yearly basis also to do its underwriting and to examine the property. And so even if it's not described perfectly, or that there's some discrepancy, sometimes you can go back and point out that the insurance company had the ability to learn for itself and see for itself when it did its underwriting what that difference was, and that's what they based their premium on, and not what was stated in the the statement of values.
Yep.
Next
All
slide.
right, let's go to the next slide here. I think I'll start on this one for just a moment, Skip. The question here is pretty simple. In most property policies, this question is pretty simple, But the question is, what is a covered cause of loss? Because in addition to having a physical loss or damage, in addition to having the covered property be what was damaged, you have to make sure that you've got a cause that is covered by the policy. Typical property policy is going to have sort of an all-risk provision, which covers almost everything that could happen to it, the fire, the physical damage, things by accident, that sort of stuff, vandalism, all those sorts of things should be covered under a policy that you typically have. In addition to the fact that you want to make sure that it's a covered cause of loss, there is going to be some effort involved in just making sure that you're proving the cause of loss. And what I mean by that, typically let's just take a physical loss or damage type of scenario. One of the things that the insurance company sometimes tries to claim is that there were already things that were deteriorating on the building, that there was already some pre-existing damage to something in the building or a pre-existing loss. And so you will often get some amount of argument from the insurance company about whether or not the things that look like they've been damaged now already existed as being damaged before. And so that's one of the reasons we're talking about those photographs, we're talking about collecting that evidence, is just to make sure that you're also prepared to prove that the damage you're now seeing is damage that was caused by the recent events.
Yeah, that's good stuff, Dan. And what I would add on to that is Dan mentioned, typically these policies are what's called all risk policy, which means basically they cover any harm to your property unless they carve it out through an exclusion. We're going to talk about exclusions in a bit, but sometimes they do, instead of calling it all risk policy, they will say that what they're covering is, the covered perils or the covered cause of loss, as the language is here. And one thing I would tell you that I haven't seen any policies of any of the attendees here, I don't think, but almost always you're going to find that civil protest and riot and damage caused by those types of things are going to be covered under a property policy. They a lot of time, we'll talk about exclusions in a bit, but typically either because it's an all risk policy and riot would fall within that, or even the covered perils, typically they would include civil protest or riot.
All right, we can jump to the next slide then, I think. All right, so one other thing to be keeping in mind is just sort of what is the kind of loss then that's covered. And what I mean by that is sort of what is it that we're going to be claiming under that policy. Typically speaking, you're going to get either repair or replacement value of your property. It's going to be minus deductible or retention, depending on your policy, but they're the same concept. It's the idea that there's some amount of loss that's going to be sort of your responsibility first and the deductible. And then after that, the insurance company is going to pay value of the property that's been damaged. And typically that's going to happen in maybe two steps, if you will. There is probably an actual cash value that is either listed or would be determined by the insurance company. And then if you actually make the repairs and do all the things necessary to put the property back into its current back in the form it was before the damage occurred, then you would actually get an entire replacement value depending on the language of your policy. So it is something to be keeping in mind that the insurance company may be looking for some proof that you're actually putting the payments to the repair and replacement of the property, and the amount that the insurance company is willing to pay you may depend in part on whether or not you're actually repairing and replacing that property as well.
Good. Should we move on to business income, Dan?
Let's do that.
All right. I'll chat a little bit about business income and extra expense. This is a coverage extension typically that you see under your property policy, so that in addition to paying you for the actual damage to your property, say there's a fire and you've got to spend $100,000 to replace the structure, and the insurance company will pay you for that, reimburse you for, pay for the replacing that structure. In addition, what typically property policies will do is also reimburse you for any business income that you lose as a result of the property damage that occurred. So if you have a fire and because of that fire you are shut down for 6 months while you have to rebuild the building, the policy would cover, and with some exceptions and some, usually a deductible of a waiting period of 24 hours or something like that. So maybe they don't cover the first 24 hours of loss, but after that, the policy would say, we will basically reimburse you for the income that you lost as a result of the property damage, and extra expense, any extra expense that you incurred as well. But it has to be business, and this is something that just kind of occurred to me as we were talking this afternoon. One catch here in this particular instance, and which creates a more of a difficulty, is the loss of business income has to be because of this property damage and not because of some other issue. And the other issue that I was just thinking about is COVID-19. And so, I'm expecting that so say in March, before the protests, your business was already losing a lot of income because of COVID-19, and then the fire came and you lost even more income because your property was burned. What the insurance company would argue is they're only liable to make up the difference for that, the income that you've lost completely versus what you were earning, during COVID-19. Now, this isn't a insurance coverage discussion on COVID-19, but Dan and I both are advising clients on that as well, and so I'll throw this in, just a little extra advice for folks is that if your business was shut down or has suffered business income loss due to the pandemic and the virus, that's also something you should be looking at making an insurance claim for. There's a lot of controversy. There's going to be a lot of fighting with insurance companies because they're claiming that the presence of virus does not constitute property damage, and so therefore they're not responsible for lost business income. But smart lawyers like Dan and me and others around the country have come up with arguments that we think might be able to get around those things and to demonstrate that the policy should be triggered by the presence of virus. But putting that aside, to the extent you have property damage at your facility, at your insured property, and you've lost income, you should be able to get reimbursed for that lost business income up until the time you get your business running again. So if it takes 6 months to rebuild it, you should get business income reimbursed for that time period. We've got a couple of other sub-bullet points here that I'll mention briefly. The first one is civil authority, and that is a coverage extension under your business income property or business income coverage. And so what it does is says, okay, so if a fire burns your building and you lose income, we'll reimburse you for that income that you've lost. But then it goes on to say, say there's a fire near you or around your building or your business, and as a result of that fire, that there's been a civil authority. And so in this instance, I suppose, and this would be an interesting question, Dan, I suppose, is if the civil authority is not based on fire, but it's based on civil protest, which resulted in fires, right. And they shut down, the governor says, everybody's got to be home by 8 o'clock at night. And you make most of your business at, between 8 o'clock and midnight because you own a convenience store where people stop. You would argue that this civil authority coverage that says, if you lose business as a result of a civil order, basically, an order by Governor Walz or Mayor Frey, you can also be reimbursed for that business income. And then and so that's civil authority. It's a civil order. We had civil orders out there. An easier argument would be if everything around you was burned and there was a civil order by some government, either the governor or the mayor, saying nobody come into that area. So even though your business wasn't burned, everybody around you was, and it's unsafe to go in there, then you would argue the civil order resulted in my loss of business, and therefore I'm covered. So that's you should just be aware that is another basis for seeking reimbursement for business income. The other thing we have got listed here is contingent business income. And this one's even something that people are even less familiar with, which means if some business that you do business with, either you sell to them or you buy from them, if they suffered a loss because of looting or burning during the riots, and as a result of them suffering that property damage, your business income is hurt, because you either couldn't get supplies from them or you couldn't sell to them. you also may be able to recover your lost income due to that, what they call contingent business income. So those are, it's kind of a complicated topic, and I've given you about 5 minutes worth of explanation, but I'll let Dan chime in with anything more he might want to add on it. But it can be very important. It can be a big chunk of money and important to businesses to try to recover that.
Yep. So what I will say, actually, no, I think that's very well done, Skip. But what I will say is that if you have suffered loss of business income, some disruption, and even if it seems like maybe it was COVID-19 somewhat, and if it was somewhat because of this is a point where Skip's right. This is a complicated area. There are lots of arguments going around right now on COVID-19 and on these various other loss and property damage type issues. So this is definitely one where if you're in that boat, go ahead and make use of the numbers that we've been giving you, or contact us and see if we can help you with the idea that maybe you've got a claim there. There's no reason for you to try to decide for yourself that you do or you don't have something called business income and extra expense coverage under your policy.
Right. Yeah. And as I've explained to clients all along, a lot of clients are nervous about submitting a claim to the insurance company because they think it's not a good claim and it's going to be denied, and then their premiums are going to go up. But I've been assured by many folks in the insurance business that your premiums don't go up as a result of a claim that's denied. The premiums go up when you submit a claim and they have to pay out on it. Then they're going to try and gouge you or get back at you. But anyway, so there's no downside to submitting a claim because you're afraid it's going to get denied. And obviously there's upside in the event that it's not denied. So
good.
Okay,
right, let's do the next slide. Yep.
Yeah. Will my loss be excluded? I think am I going to start out on this one, Dan, or are you talking about this one?
That's fine. If you let's split it in half and we'll keep going.
Okay, cool. Well, I'll so as we say here, and as I've already mentioned, an all risk policy covers all risks. That's the whole idea behind it. And the way they limit coverage then is to add some exclusions. And so you do need to look at the exclusions in the policy, and there's typically a number of them, but a number of them that will not apply to this situation that we're talking about here. There's usually an exclusion for war, and try as they might, I don't think the insurance company is going to be able to say that the riots constituted war, or nuclear radiation. There may be an exclusion for that. So typically there's going to be a number of exclusions that aren't going to matter at all. There's a few that, that could, the insurance company could try to rely upon. One that Dan sort of touched on earlier, but could be in the form of an exclusion too, is wear and tear. They don't reimburse you for just wear and tear. So if you're making a claim on your business and, some of it was clearly damaged because of the riots, but some, the insurance company looks at it and goes, that was not, that wasn't because of the riots. That was because this is just old and, it's suffered, wear and tear over the years. That's one exclusion that could come into play. And there's a couple of others. I know, Dan, maybe you want to chat about, criminal conduct or intentional acts and some of those things.
Well, I'll just mention that almost every policy has exclusions, like exclusions for an intentional acts or criminal conduct. And it's important to remember that those actually relate to criminal conduct or intentional acts by the insured, by you as a policyholder. So just because you have a policy and you're looking at it and you're saying it says that it doesn't cover criminal acts, that's not going to apply in this situation unless in the strange event that the insurance company is making some allegation against the policyholder for that sort of conduct. So just something to keep in mind, that you're going, you may have some of those issues, but they should not be ones that you need to worry about. I will say, and I'll just jump in on sort of the second bullet point for a moment here, the bullet point there, that also keep in mind that it's very, very common for an insurance company to send you what we call a reservation of rights letter. They sort of rewrite the policy into a letter. They tell you all the things that might happen to apply. That's not a determination that those exclusions do apply. It's just what they call a reservation of rights. So that you don't need to worry if suddenly the insurance company is saying something like, well, there's a bunch of things we think might happen in this policy. It's their obligation on exclusions to actually prove that those exclusions apply to your situation. So don't worry if the very first thing they say is they wonder whether certain exclusions will apply, because they'd still have to prove that they do.
But just like most everything else that we've talked about here, the devil's in the detail, and in order to make a determination as to how good a policy and how good a coverage you have, typically somebody needs to look at that policy, see what the specific wording is. But again, on a very general basis, I don't think that there's going to be a lot of exclusions that should preclude coverage here. Can we go to the next slide, Dan?
Yes. Yep.
So is this okay? So is this me? I think this is me notifying
Sure.
the carrier. So,
Yep.
yeah. So I mentioned this briefly at the start of this presentation, but what do you do when the claim first comes in? You've got a claim. How do you handle this? You got to get notice out as soon as possible. Some policies do have some timing requirements. A lot of times they just say as soon as reasonable, but sometimes they will have timing requirements that can be a little draconian. And maybe even if it's not in the initial notice, it may be in preparing a proof of loss, and Dan will be talking about that in a little bit. But anyway, you want to get a hold of your policy and get that claim submitted. Talk to your broker and ask the broker to submit the claim. As we say here in the bullet point, typically in Minnesota, if you get notice to your broker, that's considered to be notice to the insurance company, even though the broker may in some instances be representing you rather than the insurance company. But even when Dan and I get involved on behalf of clients, a lot of times, even though we're fully capable of providing notice to the insurance company ourselves, we'll recommend have the broker do it, because first of all, the broker's more familiar with the various coverages that you have, and they probably have better familiarity with who at the company to contact. Although a lot of times that's in the policy itself, will tell you who to contact and how to do it. But anyway, I'll just say this too, because the other thing in the back of my mind is always, if you tell your broker to submit the claim to everybody and they fail to submit the claim to the right people, brokers carry insurance too. And so if they screw up, then you have an insurance claim against them for errors and omissions. So this is their job, and one that they should have expertise in. So we always recommend ask the broker to submit the claim, and then always ask them to send you a copy, just for peace of mind. So okay, submit the claim to the various carriers and send me a copy. Send me an email copy, send me a hard copy. Just make sure you've got one for your file, so you've got some peace of mind that the notice has been made.
Good.
Dan, anything else?
I'll chime in with one or two things here. First, just that, so if you're not sure who your agent is or your broker is, but you happen to have a copy of that policy, even though we do think it's a very good idea to use your broker, your agent to do that, there is still nothing that prevents you from actually just taking a look at that policy, seeing there's usually a specific sort of contact information for when you're submitting a claim, submit it to this email address or submit it to this particular phone number or what have you. You can do that as well. And so as we say at the very bottom of this slide, if you haven't seen the notice, I wouldn't take any chances on with that, send a notice. Because Skip's right, we'd have all sorts of claims against brokers and agents that they messed up as well, but we don't need to give the insurance companies any reasons or excuses to delay getting a payment to you if you're owed one under your policy.
Yeah, and the notice itself is very simple. I mean, as you're going to hear in a minute, the proof of loss, and Dan's going to talk about that. That gets more complicated. You definitely want to have some professional help if you can get it for that. But the notice itself is basically saying, hey, on X day, somebody threw a Molotov cocktail into my business and it started on fire and burned down. And I'm seeking insurance coverage for that loss. And that's about all you need to do is give them the date, what happened, and the request for coverage.
Very good. All right, let's jump to the next slide.
Yeah.
Okay, so when you're documenting your losses, as we say, we've already talked about the fact that you're going to be collecting your evidence up front, trying to keep those records. And just be thinking about the fact that you're going to want to make sure you've got your photographs and your records of not just what is damaged and what is lost, but also those expenses in protecting the property from further loss or temporary fixes. You may have coverage that includes those things that you do that were immediately necessary to make sure the property wasn't subject to further damage as well. So if you've got those types of things, make sure you're keeping those records as well. And then as Skip was talking about earlier with that business interruption claim, if you've got business losses or disruption, make sure you're doing your best job at keeping those records as well, because the insurance company may want to look at them. As we'll talk about in the process of submitting that claim and actually getting that all the way through to the end where hopefully you get paid, there are plenty of opportunities for the insurance company to ask more questions. And so making sure that you're holding on to those documents as best you can is going to be important. Skip mentioned earlier the fact that we've got sort of COVID-19 going on at the same time here. And so keeping in mind that if you're keeping records about how your business was running, you may want to be making sure that you're keeping those records dating back before March, right? So that you're also sure that you're demonstrating what your business looked like in that pre-COVID-19 area as well. And then the last thing I'll mention on making sure you're keeping your records and your documents is not only do you want to make sure you're keeping your policy at hand, that you're keeping those applications that you may have submitted at hand if you still have them, but also if you've got underwriting materials, if the underwriter was coming out and visiting and they left you with an inspection report or something like that, or if you've got emails back and forth with your agent or emails back and forth with the insurance company, you may want to be making sure that you're saving those as well right now too, just so that if there is a dispute about what was covered and what wasn't, you've got as many emails as you can about what you told the insurance company or the agent or broker you needed to cover under the policy. All right, anything else to add on that one?
Nope, that was good, Dan.
All right, well then we're going to ask ourselves this question: what the heck is a proof of loss? What happens when you start getting the policy claim submitted now, and then you've actually gotten a hold of the insurance company? Is a typical next step is going to be that you're required to submit a proof of loss, right? It's a written, signed, and typically sworn document that describes the details of your loss, and it describes the totals, the amounts that you're claiming in your loss. I will tell you that in our experience, a proof of loss is almost always required, and very often a policyholder will go to their broker or go to the insurance company and say, what does it look like? What do you want? And the insurance company is not always that helpful in sort of what exactly it is. So what I will tell you is that typically what you're doing is you're doing your best job of putting all in one place, all the things that were damaged that you can think of, including all those things that Skip was talking about earlier in terms of maybe even there's smoke damage or there's loss of inventory because of those things. Getting all that in one place with as much proof as you can of sort of what that looks like. There are going to be provisions in your policy that relate to what the proof of loss should look like, of some very generic things like attaching documents that demonstrate the amounts at issue or those types of things. So do take a look at your policy. And I would say that when you're getting ready to do that proof of loss, this too might be a place where you'd really like to maybe just pick up the phone, talk to an attorney for a couple of minutes and see if they can help you just sort of understand what the best way of putting that proof of loss is together. A good, thorough proof of loss right up front really goes a long way toward getting the insurance company moving. And if it's a sort of a lean proof of loss, that's where the insurance company is going to come back with lots and lots of questions. So the more you can do to sort of put all of your proof together in one place, the better off you are.
Right. Yeah, and from a timing standpoint, I see we've got there right at the very end
Yep.
On the slide. Make sure you get it in on time. Almost every time, every policy has some sort of timing requirement on the proof of loss. Either it's an outright within so many days of the loss itself, you have to submit a proof of loss. Other times the policy will say you have to submit a loss within 90 days of the insurance company requesting one. But yep. Regardless, there will be some sort of timing requirement. As we say in the slide here, you can invariably get more time if you need more time. But don't make that an excuse for the insurance company not to pay, by failing to get the proof of loss in within the time that's allowed.
Very good.
All right. Next slide, the claims process. So there's typically, steps that we see in the claims process. We're going to probably going to be talking here a little bit more about the worst case scenario. In many cases, from a homeowner standpoint, I've had, easy times. You submit the claim, insurance company sends somebody out, looks at it. Next thing you know, you get a check in the mail. Those are the easy ones, and they're probably more unusual than the hard ones. So we're gonna talk a little more about the hard ones here, and there are some typical steps that you may be required to comply with. And the first is the notion of what we've got here is a sworn statement. Well, Dan's already talked about one form of the sworn statement, and that's the proof of loss. And typically you have to have that notarized, and you're swearing to the truth of that proof of loss and your damages. But a lot of times you'll also, I shouldn't say a lot of times, sometimes you'll be required to submit to an examination under oath. And the policy provides for that the insurance company can, request an examination under oath. We lawyers, kind of refer to the same sort of process as a deposition. Maybe you've heard of that before. But basically, it's the insurance company's representative, usually a claim rep or claim handler, who will sit down and you'll be under oath, and they will ask you a series of questions about your loss. And some of it's fact finding, and they just want to understand more about the nature of the loss. A lot of times I get a little nervous when an examination under oath is requested, because it seems to me that the insurance company is sort of stepping up the game a little bit, and maybe they're looking for a basis for excluding something under the claim. So this is a situation, again, Dan and I have already identified some spots where maybe you want to talk to an attorney. This is probably one of those, again, where an attorney can help prepare you for, first of all, help you prepare the documentation that you maybe want to bring with you to the examination under oath, and provide a copy beforehand to the insurance company. But then prepare you for the questions that we would expect to be asked, and to be there with you during the exam under oath to make objections, to seek clarifications, and then do those sorts of things to make sure that it's a good, clean record and one that supports your claim. So I don't know, Dan, if you have anything more to add about that. Otherwise, I'll let you talk about appraisals.
Yep. No, I think that's a good summary, and I agree 100% that if you get to the spot where they're asking for that examination under oath, on the one hand, you do have an obligation to cooperate in the claims process. So it's very hard to say, no way, I won't sit for an examination under oath. But that is a good spot to have an attorney involved if you can do that. What happens after there's been a little bit of that work on the proof of loss, and then the examination under oath, if one occurs, is there are times when, of course, you'll as a policyholder think that you are entitled to a certain amount of money, and the insurance company will come back saying, well, no, I don't think that it's quite that much money. I think it's something else, or they wind up with a dispute. And so we also just wanted to tell you, we've got this word appraisal here, that there are policies that then would actually require another step in the process, where you actually have a third party come in and take a look at what the damage to the property was, and sort of what they believe the amount of that is, and what they believe the value from a money standpoint is. And then both sides get to sort of try to convince the appraiser of sort of what the actual covered amount of loss is. In some policies, it's actually binding on the policyholder and the insurance company what the amount of the covered loss is based upon that appraisal. And then folks wind up carrying that to court, if there's still dispute after that, to determine what was actually covered or not covered of the things that the appraisal found. So just keep in mind that that's an additional step as well. And that is one where you're starting to really get into the complication of a dispute with the insurance company. And so if you find yourself there, probably also a good time to be getting some more clarification. What I would say is that if you wind up in a scenario where the insurance company is asking for an appraisal, make sure you're asking lots of questions about what the insurance company thinks is going on here, whether they think that they're doing something that's going to be binding on you or not in that process. And then the very last thing.
Oh, Dan, can I ask you, I wanted to throw one more question out there that maybe I'll let you take a first shot at answering it. But a lot of times in these property claims processes, an adjuster is appointed by the insurance company. And, you know, a name that I think you and I hear a fair amount is Crawford and Company. And the insurance company appoints the adjuster. The adjuster then contacts the insured,
That's right.
policyholder, and says, "Hey, I'm the adjuster here. I'm going to help you. I'm going to work with you to, you know, get this claim resolved." And my own thought is that, you know, I think a lot of times policyholders misperceive or misunderstand the role of the adjuster. But I wanted to get your thoughts on, who is the adjuster? Your friend as the policyholder or not? My view is that they are not, and that you've got to have your antenna up as to what they're doing, because I think that they're typically working more for the insurance company.
Well, I agree with that 100%, that you do have to have your antenna up with the adjuster. I also agree that they are not, I'm going to say it this way, not necessarily your friend. So you do need to go at it from a, you know, from a rather skeptical position. But I will tell you that that good cooperation with an adjuster and helping the adjuster come to the right conclusions goes a very long way to getting the right result. So just because Skip and I both agree that the adjuster is not your friend does not mean that he is not somebody who can't be quite helpful to you if you are helpful to them. So take everything with a grain of salt in this process. But if the answer is the adjuster needs information, it would be best in almost every instance to be cooperating with the adjuster and getting that information. I've certainly seen claims handling where the adjuster actually thought more of the claim than the insurance company itself. And that, I mean, the insurance company, frankly, usually winds up caving to its independent adjuster if the independent adjuster says there's a claim to be paid.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. And yeah, the one thing I would add to that is that, you know, the flip side of that is that sometimes the adjuster comes back and gets a lowball number that he or she thinks the insurance company is going to like, but you may not agree with, and you don't have to agree with that. And that's where you kind of get back to this appraisal issue again. But you don't have to just automatically accept what the appraiser or the adjuster says that something's valued at.
Well, and insurance companies do have a habit, I will say, of every time they come to a conclusion, they also put a tagline at the end of it that says, if you have any other facts or information that you think would change our conclusion. So you almost always have an additional opportunity after the adjuster makes a decision to say, wait, you're missing the following things, and let me tell you more, and maybe try to get them to, you know, put that number where it belongs to.
Yep.
Good.
And then do you want to talk just a little bit about timelines and claims handling requirements?
Yep, I will. I'll just simply say that there are statutes in Minnesota that require insurance companies to handle claims with fair practices, that require them to actually do things within certain amounts of time frames, a number of days, typically after they've got everything they need on the claim in order to actually make a decision and pay a claim. If you find yourself in a spot where the insurance company doesn't seem to be moving this thing along, it would be a good idea at that point to be thinking about how those claim handling statutes do fit in. The Department of Commerce in Minnesota is in charge of insurance companies, and they'll have resources for helping with that as well if you don't want to use an attorney. I will say that generally speaking, if you're in a dispute with your insurance company, the Department of Commerce, as a typical practice, is going to defer to the fact that there's that dispute between two people, you and your insurance company, rather than trying to step in heavy-handedly about these things. So you may have some leverage if the insurance company seems to be taking too long on this thing, but take that a bit with a grain of salt. And I think that getting an advocate like an attorney in place, if you're in that spot where the insurance company just seems to be doing nothing and it's been a long period of time, is probably more helpful than anything else you can do.
Yeah. Yeah, and one last point before we turn to the other insurance, and I know we're getting close to the end of time here, but one other thing to keep in mind during this claims process is that you may, as we've talked about, you may end up in dispute as to the value of your entire claim, but there may be parts of that claim that both sides do agree to. And typically your policy will require the insurance company, not always, but typically will require the insurance company to pay out undisputed amounts. So if there's one portion of your claim that everybody agrees this is the amount that it's worth, you can, and if the insurance company doesn't automatically say, hey, here, we'll cut you a check for that piece while we fight about the rest, you can make that demand or request that they do pay you for the undisputed amounts, and they should do that. So.
Good.
Okay.
All right, well, let's just bounce off of other insurance for a moment because Skip's right. We're nearly out of time here, but I don't think there is a lot that we need to say about these. We just wanted to make sure that people had in mind that in addition to your property policy, it's possible that you've also got some other things the broker has helped put in place, whether it be a crime policy. If you had damage to your automobile, you may actually have some comprehensive coverage for your automobile if that's a situation you find yourself in. There are other things that can happen, obviously, in terms of whether or not you've got losses where somebody is blaming you for losses or blaming you for something that happened. You may have a general commercial liability policy that would respond in that type of setting. So we don't mean to suggest that the only thing you're ever going to look at is your property policy. But there are other things that your circumstances might suggest you should also be submitting claims on under other policies. What I will say is that, as Skip mentioned at the outset, that's what your broker or agent is really for, is to make sure that you're just describing facts to the agent or broker and that they're doing the best job of making sure they're putting every policy that you have available to you on notice. If you are not sure whether or not you have a policy that covers something, that we're also available and we'll be happy to help let you know, ask the questions of you about what policies you may have and see if we can help you understand if there's something else to do other than your property policy in any particular situation. Anything else you want to add on that one, Skip?
No, I think that covers it. So I guess we'll maybe turn back to Alicia to find out if there's any questions that were posed during the session. And if not, we'll just wrap up.
Yeah, there were not any that came in during the session. And I do just want to let folks that are watching the replay of this know that if you have questions that come up, really do feel free to email us and we are happy to answer those questions. And then if you watch the replay before next Friday, the 19th, and you have follow-up questions on Friday, we're planning to do kind of just a catch-all session about things that have come into us throughout the week. And so if you do watch this before then and have more things you'd like us to address in more depth, we are happy to do that. We did also want to give you a little bit more of a preview of what we have coming up for next week. Dan, do you want to go through that?
I definitely will. I think I just wanted to mention to folks as well that I'd really encourage people to take Alyssa up on her invitation to ask questions. If you see this thing in replay, I think we've got emails there that you can send questions to as well. So that if you can think of something that we're not covering, either about insurance or that Dorsey could maybe help with that you have as a question, we'd love to hear those questions in advance and really try to be responsive to the things that are really affecting people right there in areas where there's been the various protests and riots and that type of thing. All right, so with that, I'd love to just sort of walk through for a couple of minutes here what we're expecting in our upcoming webinars next week, starting on Tuesday. We are going to have a program next Tuesday. It's a 90-minute program that's going to relate to a lot of the sort of the money issues, frankly, issues of whether or not it's your lenders on private lending for your businesses or whether it's grant and aid programs that exist. We're super excited. Actually, we're going to be having the Minneapolis Regional Chamber of Commerce. So the CEO of that entity is a gentleman by the name of Jonathan Weinhagen. Jonathan has actually been named as one of the co-chairs for the Recovery Commission that Mayor Fry had put in place. And I think Mr. Weinhagen is going to be joining us on Tuesday to help them let people ask him questions and to give some information about how the recovery program is going to work. So we're super excited about that. We've also got some folks that we're going to be adding from Dorsey, a couple of my partners who are going to be able to talk about what do you do with your lender, what do you do in terms of the permitting and so forth that you might need as you get to the rebuilding process here, and what other types of grant or aid programs may exist out there for you to make use of as you're looking at rebuilding and restoring your business. That's going to be on June 16th. And then on June 17th, we're going to switch gears a little bit to maybe some of the other issues that exist as you're kind of hoping to get yourself back up and running in terms of the real estate and leasing issues and supply chain issues. We've got several folks from our office who are going to be able to talk about some of those real estate issues, how you might be renegotiating your leases and doing some of the other work that you would have if you're a landlord, what you might be thinking about, and certainly if you're a tenant, what you might be thinking about with regard to those leases. And then also some of the issues about supply chain, right? Whether or not your inventory has been affected, whether or not you need to be renegotiating the terms of those of things like just purchasing goods for a store, or whether it's something else relating to the materials that you need for your business. We'll have a couple of experts on the webinar for that day, just talking about some of the typical terms and conditions of those supply chain agreements and whether or not you can make some claims under those or renegotiate those depending on your circumstances. Okay, and that's on June 17th from 2 to 3. And then on the Thursday, June 18th, we'll have a couple of our construction folks, attorneys who work in the construction area, who would like to talk to you about some of the precautions that you need to take as you're thinking about getting the construction going. Obviously, there's going to be lots of folks out there, trying to help with the construction, but just keeping your eyes open about the types of contract issues that might come up in that construction setting where you're trying to contract for the work to be done, and sort of what those terms and conditions might be, what you should be looking out for about sort of making sure that you're not sort of, being taken by anyone who might be out there trying to do that, and just putting the best contract in place for you for the work that needs to be done. Okay, and then lastly, on Friday, June 19th, as Alyssa described already, we're definitely hoping to have a session where, frankly, we let it be a little bit more of an open mic to folks, just in terms of pre-submitting questions to us that we can then be addressing by making sure that we ask the folks within our offices what they know about any issues that we haven't covered with you guys during the course of the week. So if you have any questions as you're here on this webinar, or as you're watching the other webinars, whether it's in person or whether it's on recording, we'd love to take your questions and see if we can help answer those as well.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. I think with that, we will wrap up our first in this series of webinars. Dan and Skip, thank you so much for all your leadership and preparation in this. And for all of you business owners, just keep remembering that we're here for you, and we look forward to hearing more from you.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you all very much. I'll put in the plug that says that we do have our contact information on the materials. So if you need us, please do feel free. And if we can't help you, we'll help point you towards somebody who can.
You bet. Thanks.
Thank you.